Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome, Unicorn Riot. Can you please introduce yourselves?
My name's Alex Binder, and I use they/them pronouns.
Hey, I'm Sean Summers. I'm a journalist with Unicorn Riot based in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I use they/them pronouns.
My name is Dan Fight, and I'm based on the East Coast, and I'm from the Midwest, and he, him, I go by that. Glad to be with you.
Amazing. I was saying before we started recording that I kept trying to, define what Unicorn Riot is or what they were doing, and I thought it would be best if I let you folks explain. What is Unicorn Riot?
Who wants? I can take it.
Maybe it means something different to all of you.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, each of us just looking at each other who wants to go kind of can help define it because we're decentralized. So we're all basically on the same page. You know, we're on the same level as far as power dynamics. We all just really care about the power of the organization itself, not about competing with each other within the organization. And yeah, I mean, we're a media organization. We publish news, whether it's breaking news or investigations. We do longer form stories and also shorter breaking media from on the ground protests happening in the moment to something that happened 10 years ago, and we're doing an anniversary piece. And we also try to highlight underrepresented stories and alternative perspectives. So we recognize that as a media organization, especially as one that's decentralized, we've always had the goal of wanting to center certain types of people and communities. And those are usually the ones that much of the media, whether they're mainstream or not, tends to overlook or sometimes misrepresent.
Most of the time, misrepresent. Alex, you were being a little generous there. Did anybody want to add on to that?
I would say it almost works a little bit like a C-SPAN, like a channel in sort of the world of activism going on to some respects, in the sense that we can kind of show up, capture a live video or long-form media, detailed media, as well as releasing documents, PDF files, the kind of stuff that is usually not posted in mainstream media, and staying on in various stories pretty early on, because we start to hear about things bubbling up a lot of times way before they break through in terms of mainstream media awareness. And so I think that's given us an audience to not just in the United States and North America, but in other continents as well, for people to understand that we have a unique way of kind of looking at those things, breaking them down, and kind of having a matter-of-fact tone about it, not overly sensationalist in a lot of respects, and as well as just live streaming. A lot of times, what we sort of earned our stripes with was streaming live events.
Was there any particular event that you really gained traction, where you saw significant growth in your audience, where you filled a definite gap that mainstream media was missing?
I'd say the first main streaming or just massive coverage we did was the indigenous-led opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Some previous members of Unicorn Riot were invited to be there for the very beginning of that fight before anyone even had any idea what it was going to turn into. And Democracy Now! Used a lot of our footage from that before they made their way there. I mean, I think our coverage helped not only alert other news media that this was happening, but also other activists and other people across the country and the world that this was happening. And I think that's how a lot of people learned the name Unicorn Riot and associated our work with social movements, with sharing the raw truth from on the ground to whoever wanted to tune in.
Yeah, like being eyes on the ground is absolutely invaluable. One can think of so many circumstances where that would have been very important, but in a country as large as the United States, and you're all coming to me from different areas, but how large is the group that you have working with you that you're able to be in all of these places and go live on top of the many other things, write about these issues and all the other things that you do? But how big of a collective is this?
Right now there are 7 full-time collective members. It's spread out, spanning from the Western U.S. to South Africa. So when we say we're decentralized, we're truly decentralized. And we also have a pretty robust network of contributors and freelance media makers who submit stuff from equally far-flung places. We get a lot of stuff from Greece. We've been getting a lot of really good material out of Palestine, and just about everywhere in between. We're a pretty small group. 7 people is not a lot of people.
It is. That surprised me, that answer.
Yeah, and I feel that sometimes. And I also feel really proud of what we're able to do given that, like, pretty small group of people at its core. Like 7 people isn't a lot to cover a single continent, let alone multiple continents.
That is impressive, right? Just the amount of issues covered, but now you're even saying it's even, you're an international collective, and I apologize for pigeonholing you like that into the United States. That is actually very impressive. Now I wonder, this, when you say decentralized, I think most of the audience here will understand what we're talking about. Do you ever label yourselves as anarchists? Is that... I wish Santiago was here, because I'm going to just talk about just a little side note before you guys can formulate. Because I said, I don't know if they're anarchists. It's not a label that's like on their website. But here I will describe to you, what they do say about themselves. And he's like, yeah, well, anarchists and labels aren't really conducive either. So, and we've had anarchist collectives on here, and I would describe Santiago and I as pseudo-anarchists because we're so fed up with the systems that we've been through and the confines of certain things. But either way, so it's not like a gotcha moment, but it just has those feels of an anarchist type collective.
What I would say is that there's a kind of a range of different political threads and sort of outlooks, frames of reference that everyone brings to the table. And we do have a sort of a range of different backgrounds and, professional adult experiences moving through activist circles, that kind of thing. I would say that we were able to pick up certain principles from those movements and experiences and sort of build that into like the mechanisms of our process. Instead of having a managing editor, one boss type of dude, we've been able to apply different things that have been picked up from movement management and from previous projects that we were also involved with. But I would say there's, kind of a mixture of different politics, and that's true with the contributors too. Like they've, I think, been coming from different, political tendencies in their countries as well. So I wouldn't just say it's all one stamped out kind of model.
Okay, that's perfect, because I don't know if our podcast here, Blueprints of Disruption, like it's mostly about tactics and different ways to structure ourselves to disrupt, not just only direct actions, right? Because a lot of the health of these movements come from on how we build them from within. And if that's kind of not working, quite often we find ourselves burnt out or stymied and stagnant. So I'd like to ask a little bit about how you operate from a decentralized kind of perspective, especially when Alex says, we're all on the same page. So if there's no one editor, how do you make sure that with all of these contributors from all of these different political, perhaps leanings and experiences, how do you then put out content that feels like on the same page?
We start in our editing by trying to pick up a lot of elements from the Associated Press style to at least create a kind of news tone around everything. And then from there, trying to be a little more judicious than, say, a more ideological magazine type of a website about terminology and sort of movement jargon, to try to make it more accessible to like a general audience. Because I think that a lot of times outlets will just sort of be writing more to their crowd, and it might not be as easy for a wider audience to understand. So I would say that's one element of how we sort of work between the different spaces of like the radical scene and the more mainstream audiences that are out there that do listen to what we are publishing.
That's interesting to think of editorial process that's mostly focused on accessibility rather than constricting the message or sticking to various topics. Because you say, writers are allowed to contribute stories that appeal to them. What do you find a lot of people are choosing to write about when they have these freedoms that don't necessarily exist in most of the mainstream media confines, or maybe even publications that do leftist or progressive stories? They feel they're telling the stories that are untold, but have a very more specific niche and appeal than you folks.
I mean, I think as long as each of us as collective members and any contributor wants to submit or contribute media that follows or like is in line with our mission statement and doesn't go against anything, like isn't racist or misogynist or any of those things, we have certain criteria, but I'd say it's pretty wide range of things we write about and things we receive. So yeah, as long as it like fits within what seems okay for our collective, then we publish it. And I think it can be tricky. And I think another big thing to highlight for our organization is that I think communication and like having a ton of meetings is a huge part of how we're organized, because we don't have bosses, because we don't have someone telling us what to do and when to do it. We have to figure these things out for ourselves. So we created the blueprints for ourselves. And so kind of to go back to your question about anarchy too, we don't say that we're an anarchist organization, but if you're looking factually at what we do and why and how we're organized, I mean, we actively do go against social norms in a lot of ways. I mean, just our organization of being decentralized and the topics we focus on and the voices and stories we highlight. So, yeah, I honestly forget. Now I'm forgetting what your main question was.
Well, it was a bit of a two-parter, and I was probably a little vague about how I was asking it. But I'm curious also now the stories that people are choosing to tell, right? When you give them that freedom and when you have like such a broad criteria, right? Like, do you ever have to reject a story? Also, I'm curious, but we'll save that for the second question because I keep blending these. But like, I want to know, what do people are coming to you like that they feel the stories that aren't being told, not even just by mainstream media, like that we're repeatedly overlooking?
I think a lot of the times on the global level, when there's a pretty big protest wave or something popping off in a country, like say Brazil or in Germany, there's like water shortages associated with a Tesla plant, for example, and that brought together a lot of different groups. And so we did special coverage on that a few times. So it's sort of like, it's also been a little bit of a way for us to kind of like show how protests come together in other countries that's sort of different than like the North American model. And I think that's one theme that's been pretty interesting that's come our direction from contributors. Another thing which has been to me very interesting is when they have investigative information about how police monitor protesters or do data mining and surveillance on people or other long-running campaigns or tactics that show larger patterns. And so that's, I think, been one of the main focuses that we've looked at, and one of the things that's been really great to get from contributors. I'd mentioned last year's story about the FBI spying on a bookstore in Chicago, and that came up from FOIA requests, and that showed that people were organizing against Cop City, which is that huge Atlanta police development, as well as abortion rights and anti-development activists. And so this one bookstore, Pilsen, was being looked at by the FBI over these things in a very recent time frame. And that, came up from a FOIA request that was brought in by a contributor who happened to fish it out of the government. And so that type of thing, sort of trying to understand at a very high level how the government tries to quash protests and monitor activists and sort of intervene with protest organizing and all the street tactics that they use in the front of those things, as well as the intelligence levels. To me, that's been a major driver. I felt that those subjects don't get a lot of attention most of the time. They're usually of strategic importance, but they get very ignored by the corporate media. So I've been really glad to work on that and link up with these contributors who've done a great job pulling out stories of that nature, because I think it's such a big deal.
That reminds me of the story also that you folks had on your website this weekend regarding the French surveillance laws that, were been put in under the auspice of keeping the Olympics safe. But it's just one of those things that kind of sets a pattern, like you spoke about, that we could see globally, but where some events are used to initiate and test the waters and whatnot, where they were using AI and algorithms to kind of, and drones to widely surveil crowds. And we can think of a million other things that they will use that for. And I'm sure like every city, most urban centers in North America have examples of police getting caught doing kind of like pilot projects that would horrify. I think Toronto police are most recently, that's where we're based, were caught using a drone program that could spot illegal firework usage and then spotlight the individual and track their movements. And so, no civilian oversight and whatnot, but that story got almost no traction here where we are.
Yeah, these different countries and localities do tend to do pilot projects. And then once those tactics are tested somewhere, they get tried somewhere else. And that's one reason why we follow Palestine very closely. A lot of population control coercive technologies, the LRAD sound cannon, for example, like those things, many of them are tested on Palestinians as almost like a beta testing lab, and then gets brought into other countries and then even into the United States. So it's great to cast a large net for that type of information.
Just really quick, going back to some of our Cop City coverage, another type of way we see testing and that we've covered it are all of the terrorism charges on all of these people who, some of which, or it might even be most of which, there's literally no evidence tying them to anything. Yet they were charged with domestic terrorism under Georgia's state level enhancement. And so that's another thing where people are just being charged as terrorists with no evidence. And so, that's what we're seeing happen. I don't know, Sean, if you wanted to talk about that at all, but.
Yeah, I feel like that's an important point, and it underscores why a lot of the things that we cover become important. And I think to go back before maybe falling down that rabbit hole, to go back to like what kind of things we get with that like broad, like casting a wide net. I think being really rooted in our mission statement and goals as an independent media org that really tries to highlight undertold stories from underserved and underrepresented people and communities. That combined with like the wide net of contributors, I think that results in getting a lot of, at the risk of leaning on a cliche, the like write what you know, quote unquote, kind of cliche. We get a lot of people who have been following these, like the things that they report on pretty closely in their local areas. And I think that shows through a lot in what we get. So we get coverage from people who are like living in an area, following the issues that are impacting the communities in that area, and then reporting on it. And I think that shows through really strongly. Like I'm thinking of our coverage from Greece about the Pylos shipwreck from last year. I believe it was last year. And this person who's been reporting on it for us has been following it and like attending rallies and reporting on it since it happened. And so that comes to mind as an example of the kind of things that we get. And then I think oftentimes we get stories that are like maybe not like the biggest thing when we first start reporting on them, that eventually turn into like a Standing Rock or like a Cop City. And so I think there's a lot of value in, not to toot our own horns, but I think like being in these spaces and following these movements and oftentimes showing up before it's a hot button issue and then it becomes like the next national thing. I think that shows through and is a strength of ours. And one of the things that we excel at as a collective in my time, like watching it before becoming a member and working with this team of people, like we are there before it's like national news and we're able to like report on it from the very beginning oftentimes. And I'm forgetting what the other question was or the thing that Alex prompted me on, so I'll wrap it up there. But yeah, I feel like that's another like result of that like wide net that we're able to cast.
It's funny because I want to contrast that with your upcoming coverage of the Republican and Democratic conventions. Because when you talk about telling like untold stories, I was really surprised to see that you folks would cover these conventions. So I'd like to, maybe you can explain what kind of gap you'll fill for the audience in something like that, because even the involvement in electoral politics kind of surprised me. I guess just that might be coming from my own cynicism. The audience will know I'm just totally fed up with electoral politics and whatnot. And, we try to focus on community organizing. But, we can't ignore what's happening. So I'd like you guys to just maybe unpack how you decided to cover something like that and how you'll make it a little different than what what do you guys call it? C-SPAN? Because it's CPAC for us, but,
Yeah, C-SPAN is a broadcaster that, films the Congress and public events and stuff like that. It's sort of an open circuit of public affairs.
Right. So, like, will you be identical to that? Hopefully not.
No, but sometimes it works out that way, right? Like if you're just filming a rally.
Yeah.
For example, we were in Milwaukee at the RNC. There's a rally with a large number of speakers, a big slate. So we just run that through on the live stream so people can get that solid sampling of what's going on with events like that. But what is, I think, important to realize, to go back to like how protests get policed in this country. For me, the 2008 Republican National Convention, which was in St. Paul, Minnesota back then, was an important event because for the 2 years before it, the government did a lot of strange tactics to crack down on people. Then they arrested several hundred people, rounded them up, and then tried to prosecute a huge number of people. And they used the most advanced tactics that they have to monitor everybody, to infiltrate with FBI informants, local informants, a lot of things of that nature. And it carried over to other probes that they did immediately afterwards as well. So these events... Yeah.
Arrested for what?
They did
the post-terror, like the terror law, post 9/11 kind of.
It was the Bush years for sure, but they would do kettling, basically. They would say, this whole crowd is a problem for us in this entire area. We're going to encircle you with police using what's called the field force operations or mobile field force tactics. Grab everybody, process everybody, and then prosecute people in huge numbers by just saying everyone was doing disorderly conduct or whatever charge.
Okay, kind of unrelated to the elections at that point.
Yeah, it's not like an electoral process type of issue. I would say that we don't usually go into the minutia of the electoral flow of activity, but we do look at all the different groups that kind of come in relation to those things. But things like the RNC were significant for us before we started Unicorn Riot in terms of just places to look at. This is how the state confronts dissent at its like most peak instance or peak configuration, right? And so that's an important reason to try to document how all of that machinery works. Likewise, in 2009, we had the G20 in Pittsburgh. Then by 2011, Occupy Wall Street came up, and that they used a lot of those same tactics in local cities. And then the NATO summit in Chicago in 2012 was another kind of similar event to that. So that's one of the reasons. Those were some of the things that fed into before we started Unicorn Riot that we wanted to look at really carefully. We knew that it was a big deal how those things went down, even if. Not even necessarily just about the issues and trying to interview people in the field, which is also important, but there's that second side of it. So that's one thing I've been trying to work on intently this summer, is just trying to educate people how these things actually work. Because most people have no idea. It's not really known to people. So
again, it's about making it as accessible as possible.
Yeah, I would say that.
I think also, definitely everything Dan said with showing how the state and the state enforcers, so different police agencies come together for these massive events like this. Because, essentially these conventions are upholding what the United States is, right? It's the president is represents America. And so it's these massive events where all the politicians come together and shake each other's hands and and so we while mainstream media is inside the convention just broadcasting everything they're talking about on the inside, probably without too many questions, we're on the outside holding our mics up to the people on the ground who are angry or however they're feeling. We want to share how they're feeling about what's going on inside these convention halls where they're not invited into, and so I think that's also a part of it is, and at the DNC, especially with Kamala now running for president, that switch just happened, and so I think there was already going to be a huge turnout of protests, and now I honestly think it's going to be even bigger. So yeah, and this coverage, we're having a big team go out on the ground for the DNC, and it's expensive and takes a lot of time and energy from us, and so yeah, I know it's understanding that it's a little bit of a surprise. Wait, you all are covering an election thing, but yeah, I think there are unique aspects to it that where we come into play.
And also we did an extensively pretty big field deployment for the 2016 cycle for basically the same purposes. It was just that in 2020, because of COVID, all those events just washed away. So it is something that we'd had experience with before, because when you see a group of people that makes it out to one of those things, behind them are, thousands of people back home who agree with those things but just aren't there, right? So it's a great way to sort of see the tip of like a lot of different social movements and sort of talk to those people and check in with how those social problems are moving along and what people might be doing next in those spaces.
I'm just kind of grinning because clearly there's a need for it, because I was under the impression that these were pretty dry events, even from the outside looking in, uncontested events largely. Over here, they mostly are. In Canada, they're very partisan things. They're really just for the party to get photo ops and media coverage, and there's very little resistance to it at all. So, yeah. And I can completely understand the need to share stories of resistance, like from across the globe, as well as like the cautionary tales of these patterns of suppression and whatnot. But maybe I'd like to give you folks space for why you think it's important to be sharing all of these riots, these movements across the globe and from within the United States as well, like the value in sharing those specific stories.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think we use the word underrepresented and untold stories pretty heavily as we're like describing what we do. And I think that is true in a lot of ways. A lot of the stuff that we report on that we're either covering on the ground or from a distance doesn't get the airtime that we think it deserves and the coverage that it necessitates. And also when it does, like when we see other, like for lack of a better term, mainstream or legacy media outlets reporting on the things that we report on, they just drop the ball perpetually at every turn. There's almost never any depth to the reporting. It's almost always towing the same lines and resorting to the same tired tropes that the police trot out to criminalize and demonize protest and social movements. And so it feels really vitally important, personally speaking anyway, and I think I can probably speak for or on behalf of the organization, it feels really important for people like us who have a deeper understanding of protest movements and social movements, and how they operate in the streets and beyond, to be able to be there and talk to people, hear why they're out there, why they care enough to risk their health, their safety, their freedom, to engage in these protest movements. It feels really important to be able to bring that context and some of that extra depth that is just so sorely and universally lacking in other coverage. And so I think that's kind of a two-pronged answer. One, oftentimes we're reporting on things that otherwise aren't being reported on. And two, to the extent that we do cover stories that do get picked up in like larger media outlets, their coverage is just so frequently so lacking. And I feel like it's really important to be out there to try to provide more context. And like my colleague Alex said a second ago, like speaking to the people who are on the ground, hearing why they're out there, rather than speaking with like a public information officer and like the chief of police. Like those people get their airtime. So I think that's kind of like a two-prong answer for why I feel like it's important to be out there.
I just wanted to mention a great example of what Sean's talking about is the way that our coverage played out covering far-right movements. And I feel like we had a really solid amount of impact around that subject by kind of changing the overall direction of the way information was circulating on the subject. So it really, for the most part, started in 2017. There was a very important rally involving white supremacists, fascists, neo-Nazis, and a lot of other, extreme far-right figures called Unite the Right in Charlottesville, 2017. And there was a very large counter-demonstration against that. Heather Heyer was killed by a fascist in a car attack. A lot of people were injured by that. And we had 3 reporters, current and former people who were at that. And what came out of that was basically we were able to do an investigation and obtain the chat logs, the internal chat records of a lot of these groups as right before they arrived, and sort of showing how they were coming from different states, how they were organizing their rides, their fundraising, their propaganda, et cetera, and also showing that they had a frame of mind to want to get into fights before they happened, which is different in the United States legal system than just sort of accidentally getting into a fight. If you have a frame of reference, you're setting out to do it, that changes the degree of essentially conspiracy to assault people. And then that also led to a major lawsuit called Sines v. Kessler against a number of those groups and their key top organizers, and they were convicted on a whole bunch of charges a few years after this, and that we did cover that lawsuit trial in detail. And then that led to a whole series of other leaks of similar, chat logs, chat records, groups like Patriot Front, Traditionalist Workers Party, Identity Europa. And so all of that sort of added up to a large amount of information, because the corporate media at the time when this happened back in 2017 was always kind of using the frame, oh, well, there's some really extreme leftists and some really extreme rightists, and there's just extremes.
Bad people on both sides,
there's just
right?
bad people on both sides, like that frame was, I think, on a generational level inside the media, picked up by editors who wanted to stick with it. But we knew that there was a lot of reporters that understood there was a much bigger social threat from these groups. And by putting out such a huge amount of information, by pushing all of those chats out, we would give more raw material for more reporters to kind of start picking that apart. And so in that sense, we created a difference in how the whole subject was being covered. And I feel like that did have a major impact because of the fact, what Sean's talking about. The corporate media can have a very odd frame around things, but if you just put out a large amount of truthful information, you can actually move the needle on those things. But it takes time and effort. But we put a lot of work into that over the years.
And sometimes there's no telling, if there'll be an uptake in that data, in that information, right? So sometimes that's part of the slog. Just keep on doing it. And then there are sometimes moments where it really does make a huge difference, right? And other folks can pick it up and give more legs to your work.
Exactly. And a lot of times it was like those kind of records work as like a snapshot. And so people, whether it was like nonprofits, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, or in some cases even prosecutors, or those lawyers that were suing the Nazis, or other activists, people in these different spaces, and all these other journalists at Huffington Post, places like that. All these different people sort of use that information to kind of work back and forwards about what all these different people were doing, and it sort of brought them out of the shadows, out of obscurity, and made it more possible to pin down more facts about them and hold them accountable more for their campaigns to harass people, to keep people in fear, in the shadows, basically. So I think that did make a big difference. I feel like it was worth the effort to work on that.
Well, I'm smiling. Anytime you can fuck over Nazis like that is gold star. But that leads me to ask you folks, I wanted to ask you if there's ever resistance to your work, and if you're doing your work well enough in this type of work, you will make enemies, right? If you're not, then you're really not doing your job. So I can see right now from just that one story, I imagine there's a lot of people who would prefer you don't do what you do. But where does most of the resistance to your work come from? Do you feel it? Or?
I mean, I think there are some people who don't view us as legitimate journalists, and that plays out in ways of us trying to get access to different spaces to cover a press conference or to cover certain events, and then we get turned away or we don't get let in. And it also happens in, we've been fighting this lawsuit for years now, basically stemming from our coverage of the opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Like Energy Transfer Partners has been trying to get internal information about our organization through this ongoing lawsuit, essentially. And
through a subpoena attached to a lawsuit they have against other people, just to be very specific.
And so through that legal battle, that's literally been years now and cost us thousands and thousands of dollars. Yeah, that's another thing that's...
It's a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing.
It's a thing you definitely have to contend with.
And we beat them at the Court of Appeals. We won in the Court of Appeals in Minnesota, but the court process continues.
That's so frustrating, right? Because the last thing, you don't want to be spending energy or the resources that you do gather on lawsuits, but even things that are proxy to lawsuits. It's just, I imagine that is what your legal defense fund is for, and any kind of possible future actions, because we know that is, I mean, it's a tool for both sides, as you just spoke about lawsuits against Nazis. It's definitely can be utilized both ways. But if there's anything kind of small movements or growing movements don't have, it's excess funds. So we will link folks to that fund in our show notes. You guys.
And we should mention we're a 501c3 nonprofit, which is the American version of a nonprofit organization. Americans can make tax-deductible contributions, including to our legal fund at unicornriot.ninja/donate. So that's how we pay the bills for our lawyers and our coverage.
We make that a spot on its own. But I'm wondering, I was curious. I love the name just because of the images it conjures up in my mind. But was anyone there for the choosing of the name Unicorn Riot? I'm just excited to do the artwork for this episode because yeah. But can anyone speak to that?
I should say, since I was involved in those discussions, it's hard to name a media organization, right? And
I agree.
Right, and so we threw around a lot of different names, and then Unicorn and Riot kind of kept coming back, and we're like, okay.
You must have a great set of people where Unicorn and Riot are those key words that come up when you know that word art that comes up.
You want some sparkle, you want some kick to it, And so we were like, okay, this is better than the other choices. People are not going to forget that easily, So that was pretty much how it landed on that.
That is just so awesome. Maybe Santiago and I can work on that because, we are always kind of stuck. But other than lawsuits, what are the other barriers to kind of stop you from putting out as much content as you can, or that sometimes sideline growth? Because I imagine you folks operate similar to some of the organizations that people work with out there that aren't necessarily media oriented, but, do depend on crowdsourcing for funds or obtaining grants or going up against large systems that would rather they not do what they're doing. So I'm wondering if there's anything that kind of keeps you guys down sometimes.
I think this doesn't feel like it has limited my output, but I think to speak to Alex's point and to go back to the question of repression for the work that we do, I think I've been fortunate in that I've never been targeted by vigilantes or Nazis or white supremacists directly, but almost every time we're in the field, the police are trying to stop us in some form or fashion. I feel like a lot of the resistance that we get comes from the state, which is scarier and more impactful in a lot of ways than one-off vigilanteism, because they have this whole apparatus. And I've never been tear gassed by a Nazi. I've never been punched by a Nazi. I've never been like had a gun pointed at me by a Nazi, fortunately. But those aren't irregular things to come from the police. And so I think that that's really emblematic, to kind of piggyback off of what Alex was saying, of like, it's more often than not the state that is like, I don't know about targeting us. I don't think that it's us specifically, but I think they're like targeting journalists in general. I think in terms of what limits our like ability for what limits our output to the extent that our output is limited, personally speaking, I think it's capacity in terms of like reporting on the things that we report on is pretty heavy, and we're a small collective, and there's always 100 things that are going on that we can't talk about or can't cover because we don't have the capacity, whether through just like the number of people that we have or the resources that we have to throw at any one story or beat or topic. I feel like so frequently it just comes down to resources, and then especially in the last year or two, like platforms, like social media platforms, and getting our coverage from the field to the audience it relies on, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, these huge media conglomerates. Even though we're an independent media outlet, we're still pretty reliant on social media. And we've seen the shit show that is increasingly in the last couple of years. And that's something that we've grappled with, trying to figure out how to move away from that and be more autonomous. I don't know if either Alex or Dan wants to speak to that anymore, but I feel like that's a pretty big like choke point in our workflow.
I'm actually not sure if people in Canada can even see our headlines in Facebook, because I know Facebook blocks news headlines and has for a while in Canada, right? Like that's going on. That doesn't get much attention in the States, right? But that probably affects us too. And so, yeah, these fickle platforms, right? Like they'll rise and fall. Facebook, we have hundreds of thousands of people following our page. Is it actually showing those to those people? Small percentage, right? So that's why other independent media places, as well as us, we try to stress that there's also an email list, because email is less subject to algorithm juking than counting on Twitter, X, etc. But we also, we are building up a TikTok page, because, TikTok is a new audience. So like as it evolves, right, you have to find ways to redistribute, to get those new audiences out there, things like that. Like it doesn't really settle into just being like, oh, these are all the pages we needed, but we try to run it so that the website is kind of the main core, but then it kind of goes out from there. And we have a new sort of media playback thing. So you have some nice galleries that show like our longer pieces, things like that. So we've tried to like work around the limitation of social distribution by like stressing our own website and our own parallel distribution as much as we can.
I understand that frustration so much, especially when you've got a story that is an important one, but not necessarily a big one. And you want to give it as much, like, it deserves more space than it's ever going to get from the algorithms. To be dependent on those systems is so incredibly frustrating, especially if you don't fully understand how they work. And plus, how they work is always shifting.
It's always shifting.
It's always shifting, yeah. And then you get a new platform you have to master. But, yeah, that is part of the struggle for, I think, organizers in general, right? Because certain platforms work better to get the word out. But then, when you hit on certain issues, that's they get kind of red flagged. I know here you can't talk about housing and a lot of stuff on Facebook. It'll be flagged, and the lack of news sources that are available. But you can only imagine that Canadian independent media is having quite a struggle having to circumvent the limitations that are on them there when it comes to Facebook and whatnot.
Yeah, it's out of control these days. I mean, it's very difficult. And it's difficult in the nonprofit sector, because what's been going on is like funders can be kind of fickle, like when they support, places like ProPublica or whatever, or The Intercept. They'll do it for a while, then they'll leave, pulling out the program budgets. And then obviously the for-profit media sector, newspapers, venture capital, mass layoffs. And every time there's more layoffs, that means that there's less journalists who might pick up our material and recirculate it out to new audiences and stuff. So I think that both downturns in the nonprofit side and, to me, the commercial media side, that both affects the overall information climate, and I think that is a drag, not just on us, but all the other independent media. There aren't that many independent media really operating now. Like, what is disconcerting is you get out to something and you're like, oh, we're the only journalists that are even at this thing, period, right? Whereas maybe 5 or 8 years ago, might have been more journalists, right? And like that affects the whole climate, and so we're fighting with that kind of wind on this situation.
Let me ask you about another trend, and again, anyone can answer. For folks that follow social movements and protest movements pretty closely and from all corners of the globe, can you comment on any trends that you've seen, or if you share a sense of optimism in what we're seeing? Obviously, most telling right now is the Palestinian solidarity movement and its growth and its both in its numbers and its daringness, right? People pushing boundaries, whether or not that's paying off in real time for people in Gaza or the West Bank, it's not at the moment. But, I feel, and I think we've talked about here on the show, that there is this awakening that's happening in folks understanding the limitations in the typical systems that have been put forth to them as democratic and what is actually available to them, right? The power that's actually available to them and the possibilities that are out there beyond signing petitions and whatnot. And so, so I'm wondering if you folks can lend us any special insight from the work that you do.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So I would say right now there's a lot of extremes happening, and I think there's probably always been extremes. Like I think it's funny when people point out like certain things in history, like, oh, that was the really big important moment, but like there's constant big important moments. But I think right now, I mean, it was just like in the United States with this election first, I mean, it might be like one of the most extreme ones we've had in a long time. In addition to, all of the protest movements happening worldwide, like in Bangladesh, all of the protests happening there. I don't know, I feel like there's just constant political dissident everywhere. And I mean, I honestly think it's kind of like what's happening now is just repeating what's always happened, where people are remembering that protesting is necessary and that it's truly the only way for change to even have any ability at all to actually happen. And I think people tend to forget or get complacent or are too busy or are too bogged down or too bummed out by everything. And then they kind of like remember or something. And then it's like, oh, right. Like we can do something and like we need to do something. And I think that's also why mainstream media and legacy media portray protests how they do and demonize them, because they go against what's like the status quo. And if protest movements happen and they are successful, then, which, by the way, like, I mean, having everything we have from like the access to news, and I mean, in the United States, even though there are a lot of rights being compromised right now, specifically with like trans rights, abortion rights, we do in fact have a lot of rights in this country, though. Like, I don't want to like, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And if we're talking about global issues, but those rights were only, like, we only have those rights because people fought for them, like in the streets, like people died. And that's why we have rights that we do. And I don't mean like wars. I mean like people just like us talking right now, like went up against people in power to fight for like civil rights, to fight for voting rights, to fight for so many things. And honestly, I just kind of see that happening again, but on bigger scales because, and honestly, maybe because of social media too, because of the reach of TikTok and like other platforms where it's maybe being seen as like the popular cool thing to do. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, as far as like more unique insights though, I also kind of just think because things with like climate change are getting so bad, and I honestly just feel like young people specifically are just like, everything's fucked, so we're just gonna, like, everything's on the line anyway, so we might as well just put our bodies on the line for these things, because why not? Like, literally, what else should we be doing with our lives? And so yeah, I guess that's how I see it.
What I thought was very interesting this spring was, the Gen Z, the young crowd, came out strongly and pretty quickly organized a lot of Palestine demos, not just in the U.S., but in a lot of other countries, right? The crackdown at Columbia sort of worked like what they call the Streisand effect to draw attention to it, and it went way bigger. A lot of those young protesters that I talked to, did agree that it was like kind of a catalyzing moment for a lot of their generation, right? Because they can either go in a apolitical direction, detached from those things, or in a direction where they're more willing to do something and not just ignore things. And I think that this really kind of put a mark on that generation. 4 years ago, we saw it with the George Floyd uprising that started in Minneapolis. That was something we should mention. We were very closely involved with covering right as it started, basically. And that picked up all across the country. There was a lot of tension that was building in the country. I think one of the things that we look for is, where is tension building up? You never know when a precipitating incident will shake the boundaries of the society, but you do try to look for where the tension is building up. And so I think in 2020, in 2024, we see that kind of mobilization. We also have seen, for example, in Europe, just in the last few weeks, the far right, the hardliners, Le Pen, and those people in France got rebuffed by a wide majority of centrists and leftists in the French elections, right? The Tories fell out of power after 14 years in British politics. That's a long time, right? So it shows that people are not just all moving along straight to the hard right wing. That's not like an inevitable thing. It shows that there's an alternative vision out there, whether that comes across in elections or policies or different spheres. You can see it's not all just one track moving straight to the hard right. And I think that is, to me, that's an encouraging thing, regardless if it's part of elections or not. So, and I think that we see that. That's one of the reasons why I like to go out and talk to people that are involved in all these different things that are not just about elections, but it shows that people care, they're getting involved, a new generation's coming up, people are passing tactics from the older cats down to the new kids, things like that.
Yeah, my feelings about this question are complex because I feel like I'm of several minds about it. I guess, like, first off, I don't pretend to have any like extra insight beyond anybody who's like out in the streets experiencing these things. I think I'm a blend of optimistic and pessimistic. I think I'm optimistic, kind of what Alex was saying a minute ago and what Dan piggybacked on. Like, at the risk of sounding like an old fogey, like, these kids out here today are like wild, and it's great to see there's a new generation excuse me, there's a new generation of young people who are entering these movement spaces and kind of with like a fuck it attitude, like really embodying this like no future ethic in like really liberatory ways. That's super inspiring. And at the same time, I cover a lot of environmental movements in the US, and so that's a lot of my context. And thinking back to Atlanta as the most recent, like, big spark point around, like, in that space, while the energy has increased and people are more willing to engage in directly confrontational and adversarial tactics, it seems like, than in times that I can remember, the state has also kept up really apace, and has outpaced a lot of these movements in a lot of ways. Like Alex mentioned a few minutes ago, like these RICO charges in relation to Atlanta, it's the repression is intensifying, I think, across the board, because the state knows, and right-wingers know, and authoritarians of all stripes know that when you get down to it, their ideas aren't generally popular. They're like, people aren't super excited to fall in lockstep for the most part. And so they're prepared to repress people who are fighting back against that. And I think we see that repression ramping up in a lot of ways. And while this country has always been incredibly violently repressive against movements that have challenged the status quo and challenged the seats of power, it feels like that repression is escalating in a lot of ways. In the same way that people are kind of approaching these movements with like this fuck it attitude, it's like there's why wouldn't they? Like, you're going to be charged as a domestic terrorist whether you lock yourself to a piece of equipment with a bike lock, or if you set a piece of construction equipment on fire in the night and like maybe don't get caught. So they leave very little like space in between to act. And so I don't know, that's a kind of convoluted and long answer for optimism versus pessimism. But I think that there's a blend. I'm optimistic that people are engaging in these ways, and I'm pessimistic in the way that the state has kept up and increased its repression.
There's hope even in your pessimism, though, and you kind of verbalized it, because people lose that fear or that reservations that they have that often hold movements back. Not that like everyone, well, I'm not gonna, not that everyone should be setting construction equipment on fire, but I'm not going to tell you not to either. But my point is, sometimes worrying about optics even holds people back. And whether it's going to be charges or bad press, it seems like no matter what you do, you're going to face that kind of same level of resistance. So you might as well give her. And that same nihilism that can be heartbreaking, and demoralizing, is also what is spurring a lot of the work. There's people working on two different tangents, but if they're working out of hope or they're working out of nihilism and they're still getting to the same point, then it can be utilized. But, it's not a great way to have to go at something, right? To think that your future is fucked no matter what. So I at least want to go down fighting, and be on record that I simply did not do nothing. But I think there is a lot of people that are still operating and working with those nihilists, right, out of hope, where it's like, don't you worry, then you keep that attitude and that is just fine, but we will get there, and hopefully we can like lean on each other, because I'll ebb and flow between those two spots. myself, right? But both kind of are fuel. They both sit as fuel, even though maybe sometimes they should allow us to rest. But there's that's another episode, the value of rest. We don't have time for that right now.
I also think you can be like a hopeful nihilist too. Because I think like in the moment, it's like, I mean, to be honest, that's kind of how I am, if I'm going to be real. Because, yeah, I mean, things are bad, but I still I think if I was a full-blown nihilist with no hope, like, I don't think I'd be in the Unicorn Riot, first of all. But, yeah, there's like still some things we can do to like lessen harm. I like to think of things in like a harm reductionist standpoint. So it's like looking at things and just like lessening harm. It's like I feel like that's also kind of what we do in our capacities as journalists. Also,
we do that through voting in Canada a lot, and I imagine the U.S. election feels like that to a degree. Where, voting in itself is a practice in harm reduction and not much else. But
yeah.
I wanted to mention just in terms of how people look at optics, because I've obviously seen countless examples of arguments about protest tactics. And, a lot of times it's unclear what the best move is for different reasons, et cetera. But, in America, it's an election year right now. Everything's kind of a blur, right? Like Biden dropped out of this race like less than 2 weeks ago. That seems like a long time ago. Trump was shot at by a kind of a random person, just like a few days before that, right? And even that is already almost forgotten, And so, like, when people really fixate on, like, the optics of a protest, I think that they tend to usually overestimate how much it'll necessarily be remembered over a long period if it was like so edgy or something to offend someone, like an offensive message on a sign or whatever, right? Like it's forgotten now. In the Vietnam War, there was lots of signs about the Viet Cong and stuff, with those protests that are kind of forgotten today. But I think in today's context, when they try to say, oh, this protest is too offensive, this is too whatever, it's like, I don't know. I think it all gets lost in the wash pretty quickly. And that's my like observation on that. I don't know what the best tactics are or not, but I do think people lose perspective in the media environment as to like what is even remembered as bothering people, even like a few days later.
Yeah, I think, and then that helps you knowing that, or at least accepting that, allows you to focus on what people do retain, or the impact on the individuals involved. Like, will that change them? Will that give them growth, right? Or the movement growth? Because, we had folks from Last Generation Canada on recently. I don't know what the timeline will be for the episode releases, and they spoke of, we always want to bring as many people along as possible, but in reality, you're looking at 3.5% of folks to, overturn a system. So you don't, you don't necessarily have to please everyone with your tactics.
And the corporate media will tend to just, get really concerned with activists. Like, well, didn't you create a traffic jam by marching today? And what about that? And it's like, well, traffic jams happen every day. Like, let's focus on the issues that are feeding into why people came out today. Like, sure, that could have annoyed some people. There's no point in denying that. But like, focus on the issue, right? Don't lose sight of that perspective, and that relative importance. And likewise, smallish things like protests or infighting, that's something the corporate media loves to play with. We don't ignore those things, but we say, let's take it in proportion, right? How much does it actually matter, right? And that's like the loss of perspective that I think the corporate media loses. And I think that's one reason people appreciate our kind of matter-of-fact approach to looking at how those things relate,
And corporate media's version of proportionality is flying a really big, expensive helicopter over the crowd to say, look at how these protesters are blocking the traffic.
Shame.
They don't go down there to interview anybody. We kind of forced them in 2020 because we were doing their interviews in the street then the corporate media really did have to bring out more street interviews to actually talk to people when this stuff was kicking off, that type of on-the-ground stuff, bringing it down there, sort of pulling it down there again, away from the corporate helicopter, right?
Absolutely. Santiago's going to love to hear this because it's like part of what we try to do at a very small scale here. It's just the two of us. But, just being with the movements and to witness them and to draw attention to them and amplify the work that they do. So that, because, half the struggle is just getting legs to this work, right? Whether it's a big story or a protest or whatnot. Drawing attention is half the work. So before I let you folks escape to keep doing the good work, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Speaking of helicopters, we are trying to get a Unicorn Riot news helicopter. So unicornriot.ninja/donate.
Who's going to fly it?
I thought we were going to get
a
boat.
The unicorn that we're also getting.
I thought we were getting a boat.
Oh, we're getting a boat too? Oh,
Steve
man.
Irwin,
okay.
too.
There's a lot of pressure on the paint job this helicopter would have to have. You realize that? Like pure sparkle rainbows.
Yeah, we got like a vinyl wrap guy.
This is important.
I would just say it helps a lot if you share our work or email it to your friends, stuff like that. We also, people print out our stories and send them into prisoners. We've done a lot of coverage about these certain prisoner stories lately, that type of thing, conditions inside prisons. Those are places that don't have access to internet, so that is also really appreciated. But yeah, just, small group. We depend on everyone kind of doing their own distribution out there. And it's Creative Commons. You can make copies. You can have screenings of our films if they're free.
We don't even have to ask you.
No, but if you can let us know, then we can let people know that they're happening. But people have just organized screenings of a bunch of different things, like our full length from the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is called Black Snake Killers. And that aired in a lot of different countries, has subtitles in many languages. So we really appreciate that, that little oomph of distribution, because we're so small, we can't just cross-post everything ourselves.
Just a quick fact check. You can access internet from prison and jails. It's not like an all the time type of thing and depends, it's dependent, but.
Well, I think that's a cool idea, though, to print them out and send them in. But thank you for that clarification. Abolitionists over here. I've been waiting to get prison abolitionists on the show, so if you know any really good ones, you can send them my way. Or folks that have time to talk about the work, because there's so much being done there, thankfully. But I want to thank you all for taking the time, and you really did sit down and reflect on the questions there. And I do appreciate both the insight you provided, but more especially the work that you folks do. I'll be consuming even more of it now, and I'll be sharing it as we do with all our guests afterwards. But yeah, very, very, very much appreciate the 7 full-time people there at Unicorn Riot and all the contributors. I'd love to be a fly on the wall as you guys make decisions and do what you do. But I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.